World Empires Series, Part 3, Cyrus and the Persian Dawn Chapters, 814-539-400 BC Introduction. In the last part we watched Jerusalem burn and the people of Judah marched into exile in Babylon. Empires, it seems, are the great constants of the ancient world. One rises as another falls, one conqueror replaces the last. But what happens when a conqueror comes who does not destroy but restores? That is the story of Part 3, the story of Cyrus the Great and the world he built. Chapter 8, the Persian rise to power. By the middle of the 6th century BC, the Neo-Babylonian Empire that had humbled Egypt and destroyed Jerusalem was itself beginning to weaken. Nebuchadnezzar had died in 562 BC, and his successors were a troubled series of short reigns. Meanwhile, to the east, something extraordinary was happening. Cyrus II of Persia, known to history as Cyrus the Great, was an Achaemenid Persian king from the region we now call Iran. Between 559 and 539 BC, he created the largest empire the world had ever seen. He absorbed the Median Empire, conquered the fabulously wealthy Lydian kingdom of Croesus in Asia Minor, and pushed his borders in every direction. The Greek historian Herodotus watched from the west with a mixture of awe and alarm. What made Cyrus different from every conqueror before him was not the size of his empire, but the manner in which he ruled it. He did not destroy. He did not deport. He did not humiliate the gods of conquered peoples. Instead, he made a point of respecting local religions, restoring temples, and presenting himself as the legitimate king within each conquered culture's own framework. In Babylon, he presented himself as the chosen servant of the god Marduk. In Judah, he would present himself as the instrument of the God of Israel. Chapter 9, the Fall of Babylon. In 539 BC, Cyrus marched on Babylon. The city, then under the rule of the deeply unpopular King Nabonidus, did not put up much of a fight. The Cyrus cylinder, discovered in 1879 and now in the British Museum, records how the city's gates were opened to him without a battle. Nabonidus was taken prisoner, and Cyrus entered Babylon not as a destroyer but as a liberator. The Cyrus cylinder is one of the most extraordinary documents to survive from the ancient world. Cyrus declares in it that he returned the gods of conquered peoples to their original shrines, restored their sanctuaries, and allowed exiled populations to return to their homelands. It has been called the world's first declaration of human rights, a description that is debated by scholars but captures something true about its remarkable spirit. For the Jews in Babylonian exile, the fall of Babylon felt like a miracle. The prophet Isaiah, writing either before or during the exile, depending on which scholarly view you hold, had actually named Cyrus by name as the one God would use to restore Israel. "He is my shepherd and will accomplish all that I please. He will say of Jerusalem, let it be rebuilt, and of the temple, let its foundations be laid." When Cyrus actually appeared and did exactly this, it seemed like divine confirmation of everything they had believed through the darkest years of exile. Chapter 10, the Edict of Cyrus and the Return from Exile. In 538 BC, the year after his conquest of Babylon, Cyrus issued what the Bible calls the Edict of Cyrus, a decree allowing the Jewish exiles to return to their homeland and rebuild the temple in Jerusalem. He even returned the sacred vessels that Nebuchadnezzar had taken from the temple, and he authorized funding for the reconstruction. This was not simply generosity. It was smart imperial policy. Loyal local populations, tied to their restored temples and grateful to the Persian crown, made for better subjects than resentful deportees. But whatever Cyrus's motivations, the effect was transformational. The return from exile, however, was not as triumphant as the prophets had promised. The reality was complicated. Many Jews chose to stay in Babylon. They had built lives there, raised families, established businesses. Those who returned found a ruined city, a landscape of devastation, and the enormous practical challenge of rebuilding from scratch. The Book of Ezra records the difficulties: opposition from local populations, conflicts over land, the grinding slowness of reconstruction. The Second Temple, smaller and plainer than Solomon's original, was eventually completed in 516 BC, 70 years after the destruction of the first. When the foundations were laid, the older priests who had seen the first temple wept, while the younger generation who had grown up in exile shouted for joy. The sound of weeping and the sound of rejoicing mingled together and could not be distinguished from one another. It is one of the most human moments in all of ancient history. Chapter 11, The Persian Empire, How IT Worked. The Persian Empire under Cyrus and his successors was the largest political entity the world had yet seen. At its height, it stretched from the Aegean coast of what is now Turkey all the way to the Indus Valley in modern Pakistan, an area of over 5 million square kilometers, encompassing perhaps 40 million people. What is remarkable is how effectively it was governed. The Persians organized their empire into provinces called satrapies, each administered by a governor called a satrap, typically a Persian nobleman, though sometimes a local figure. The satraps collected taxes, maintained order, and reported to the king. Crucially, a separate system of royal inspectors, called the eyes and ears of the king, kept watch over the satraps and reported directly to the crown, preventing any single governor from accumulating too much independent power. The Royal Road, a paved highway stretching 2,700 kilometers from Sardis in western Turkey to Susa in Iran, allowed royal messengers to travel the length of the empire in about a week. Herodotus was so impressed by the Persian postal system that his description of it became the inspiration for the motto of the United States Postal Service. Communication, logistics, and a relatively light touch on local customs, these were the foundations of Persian power. Unlike the Assyrians, the Persians generally allowed conquered peoples to maintain their religions and languages. The empire was, by ancient standards, extraordinarily tolerant. Chapter 12, Ezra, Nehemiah and the Rebuilding of Jewish Identity. Two figures dominate the story of the Jewish restoration in the Persian period, Ezra and Nehemiah. Both came from Babylon, both had the backing of the Persian crown, and both were focused on a single project, the reconstruction not just of Jerusalem's walls, but of Jewish identity itself. Nehemiah was the cupbearer to the Persian king Artaxerxes I, a position of enormous trust and proximity to power. Around 445 BC, he received permission to return to Jerusalem as its governor and rebuild its walls. The book of Nehemiah gives us a vivid first-person account of the project, workers building with one hand and holding a sword in the other, constant harassment from neighboring peoples, the political maneuvering required to keep the project alive. In 52 days, according to Nehemiah, the walls were rebuilt. Ezra was a priest and scribe, an expert in the Torah. His project was the spiritual reconstruction of the community. He gathered the people in the town square and read the Torah aloud from morning until midday. Interpreters stood with him to make sure even those who no longer understood Hebrew could follow. When the people heard the law read, many wept. The exilic community had preserved the texts. Now those texts were being returned to the land. This moment, the public reading of the Torah, the people's recommitment to the covenant, is often seen as the moment when Judaism as a religion, centered on scripture rather than temple sacrifice, was effectively born. The exile had stripped away the land and the temple. What remained was the Word, and the Word proved indestructible. Chapter 13, The Persian Wars and the Greek Encounter. The Persian Empire did not exist in isolation. To the west, across the Aegean, lay a cluster of small, quarrelsome, brilliant city-states, the Greeks. And the relationship between Persia and Greece would produce some of the most famous military encounters in history. Cyrus's successor, Cambyses, conquered Egypt in 525 BC, adding the Nile Valley to the empire. Then came Darius I, arguably the greatest administrator in Persian history, who organized the empire, built Persepolis, and standardized coinage and weights across the vast territories under Persian control. Darius also looked west. The Greek city-states of Ionia, on the western coast of what is now Turkey, were part of his empire and had recently revolted with Athenian support. Darius sent a punitive expedition against mainland Greece. In 490 BC, at the Battle of Marathon, a small Athenian army defeated the Persian force. The messenger who ran to Athens with the news, the original marathon runner, then collapsed and died, which is either a beautiful legend or a cautionary tale about overdoing it. 10 years later, Darius's son Xerxes came with a far larger force. He bridged the Hellespont with boats, marched hundreds of thousands of soldiers into Greece and burned Athens. But at Salamis, where the Athenian fleet lured the Persian ships into a narrow channel where their superior numbers were useless, Persia suffered a catastrophic naval defeat. Xerxes watched from his golden throne on the hillside as his fleet was destroyed. The Persian Wars did not end Persian power. The empire continued for another century and a half. But they demonstrated that the small, fractious, intensely creative Greek world could not be easily absorbed, and they gave the Greeks a mythology of freedom versus tyranny that would shape Western political thought for centuries. Chapter 14, Key Sources and Further Reading. The Persian period is richly documented. The Cyrus cylinder in the British Museum is the single most important primary source, its text available in translation online and in many books. The Hebrew Bible's books of Ezra, Nehemiah, Haggai, Zechariah, and Esther all deal with the Restoration period. Esther is particularly fascinating as a window into Jewish life at the Persian court, though its historical accuracy is debated by scholars. Herodotus's Histories, written in the mid-5th century BC, is our primary Greek source for the Persian Wars, and one of the most entertaining history books ever written. Bear in mind that Herodotus was writing from a Greek perspective and was not above a good story, but his factual core is generally reliable where it can be checked. For scholarship, Pierre Bryant's From Cyrus to Alexander remains the definitive modern history of the Achaemenid Persian Empire. Joseph Blenkinsop's Ezra Nehemiah in the Old Testament Library series is the standard scholarly commentary. And Amélie Couet's collection The Persian Empire, a corpus of sources, is invaluable for primary documents. End of Part 3.